right, Steve Denise here, brand director with Maizex, and I'm with Lead Agronomist Greg Stewart. Greg, we've measured, so we're accurately doing the social distancing thing with the video. So
very good.
And we're here today. We're excited. It's that time of year again where we're going to go out as part of the Great Ontario Yield Tour. And Greg, this year we're going to have more people involved than we have in quite a while to actually go out and do yield estimates.
Right on.
And so our goal here today is to share with our cooperators and with our dealers that are going to be involved what's the best way to do a yield estimate.
Right.
So we've picked out, normally we'd be between rows in a cornfield, which is the videotape, so we're along the edge of a field here. So Greg, what do we do?
Right. Well, I guess your first point, Steve, is really good. We are standing at the edge of the field for the purposes of demonstrating, but normally when you go to the field, you got to walk in past the headlands, right? And then we suggest, a good 10 paces or more into the field itself, so you get away from any headland effect, right? And we suggest try to find a uniform spot in the field, or at least avoid spots that are particularly problematic, a tough spot, maybe a spot that really had a tough go in the spring. So trying to find a representative spot in the field is job one. Through the headlands, a good at least 10-15 paces into the field, pick that spot. Then our protocol when the Great Ontario Yield Tour is to measure 30 feet of row. And so whether you've got a rope like this where you can hook onto a stalk and then pull the rope down 30 feet, or whether you use your trusty tape measure that's got 30 feet, we're measuring 30 feet of row. And some people suggest, well, why don't you do 17 feet 5 inches? The reality is it's a bit of a tradition to use the 30 feet approach. And this year with so much variability in the corn, 30 feet rather than 17 is probably going to help us.
More representative.
A little more representative.
Yeah.
So you go into the field, you measure out that 30 feet a row, and then you count. And of course, the critical thing, Steve, in that discussion is that we're counting ears, not plants, right? So if you find a plant that doesn't have an ear on it, it's not getting counted. You're counting good, viable ears, and the number of ears you have in that 30 feet is the key first number that you need to gather.
So take out the runs, take out everything else.
Yeah. And if you happen to be in a field where there's low population, where there's a few of those around this year, and you have a viable, good second ear, that would be, you would count it as part of the total number of ears. Now, here we're along a side row without any competition on the one side, so there'll be more double ears. So that's just a bit of a abstraction from this particular row. But in general, when you're out in the field, you won't get a second ear that's terribly countable, let's say. But in situations where low pops and maybe some good second ears, they should be included in the total number of ears in 30 feet.
Okay.
So then you get to the end of the row, you've counted all the ears you have in 30 feet, and then we ask you to pull off 3 sort of random ears. In the guidelines for the Great Ontario Yield Tour, we suggest when you get to the end of the row, you pull off ear number 5, 8, and 11.
Okay. And
then when you've got those ears pulled off, you essentially do kernel counts. So I've got one here from this row, and we're about 40 long on this ear and about 16 around. So that's what you record, 40 long and 16 around. Now be careful, this is obviously a ear that's fairly immature. You can't count right to the end. You've probably got to pull back at least an inch from the end of that ear where you wouldn't try to count kernels. As you get into more mature fields, it's quite obviously when viable kernels stop. But if it's a little on the immature side, you'll have to just be a bit cautious to not go out right to the end of the ear counting kernels. I stopped at 40, and that still left us about an inch of ear that I didn't count extra kernels on the row.
And this year, it's probably going to be easier, like you said, because the crop was in earlier. Last year, as an example, you know, we were really having to define what an ear was. So.
Yeah, exactly. We won't have many ears this year that look like this in the actual tour, but last year we had quite a few that were on the immature side. So essentially, that's the first stop in the field. 30 feet of row, count all the viable ears, pull off 3 ears, and get a count for length and rows around and record that either in the app on your phone or on a clipboard sheet of paper. Then we ask you to repeat that process a second time. So move, 15 rows to one side and walk another 40 feet back into a different spot in the field, and essentially just repeat that. So at the end of the visit to the field, you've got 2 sets of data, which in those data sets gives you ear number, average rows around, and average length. Then you'll have another spot, number of ears, average rows around, average length. You average that all together to give you those 3 key factors that go into determining yield. Number of ears you have, average rows around, and average length for the field. And then the app will do a calculation for you to get you your bushels per acre, or on a clipboard we'll give you a little guidance on a worksheet which will help you get to bushels per acre.
So in advance of when we're going to the field, we're likely going to contact the producer.
Right.
And probably a good idea then would be to ask them to say, look, what would a representative part of the field be? Don't send me to the
Yes.
to the really good spot or the really bad spot. What would be representative?
Or don't necessarily send me to your best field or your worst field.
Yes.
Can you send me to a representative field? Or maybe if you have time, you do one of his better ones and one of his tougher ones. Yeah. So that's the key elements of doing the yield tour stop in a cornfield.
All right, Steve Denise here, joined again by Lead Agronomist Greg Stewart, and we've been talking about the yield tour, and an equal part of the yield tour, not just measuring corn yield estimates, but also soybeans. So Greg, how do we do a soybean yield estimate?
Yeah, if you thought corn was fun, wait till you get to do soybeans. So the same principles apply. You're looking for a representative spot in the field, so that generally means you want to walk in past the headland and get orientated with the rows, and then essentially use your tape measure or a pre-measured rope to do 10 feet of row. So Steve, if we give you this end here, you just find the spot in the row and stick that in. You'd pull it down, tot it up a little bit, and then once you've got that 10 feet measure, you count every plant in that 10 feet. Also remember to record in your data sheet or on the app what the row width is for the field, whether it's 7.5s or 15s or 22s or 30s, right? We got to make sure we have that information in the app or on your data sheet. And then once you've got that 10 feet section marked out, you pull out 3 again representative plants and count all of the pods on those 3 plants and get sort of an average pod count per plant. So essentially you end up with 10 feet of row, total number of plants in that row, and then the average number based on 3 plants, the average number of pods per plant. And when we're counting pods, we generally have to be careful to not count flowers or tiny little pods. We set our threshold that a pod's got to be 3/4 of an inch in length before we would count it. And so once you get those numbers, again, into your app, onto your spreadsheet, and we can calculate bushels per acre based on that 10 feet, 3 plants, and again, done twice in the field.
Yep, so same as corn, we're going to talk to the producer up front, we're going to get permission or have them meet us, and then ask them for a representative part of the field.
Right.
So what we're doing here, some of the warnings on TV shows is don't try this at home. So we're not doing the edge of the field when we're actually doing the yield tour. We're going to make sure we go inside.
Yeah, it's to show you the idea of 10 feet of row, but a key in any good soybean, it's a little bit easier in soybeans to visually sort of, okay, that looks like a representative spot. But yeah, you need to move out, generally speaking, at least 60 feet into the field to get a good count.
Excellent. Well, we're looking forward to the yield tour this year once again. The last couple of years, our estimates coming out of the yield tour, both on corn and soybeans, have been really quite accurate to what the final crop has been, Greg. So
yeah, and I think there's more interest this year because of just the early plant, the late plant, the dry, the wet. There's maybe more curiosity or interest in terms of what's really out there in our fields than there has been in the past few years.
Yes, very good. Well, thanks very much, Greg.
You bet, Steve.